"Divorce me. You know why." The day after the funeral, my husband casually said it. My sister was clinging to him, arms wrapped around his neck. It seemed they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. There was no inheritance for me from my father. As soon as they knew about it, this was their attitude. My sister, mother, and now ex-husband were all wearing shabby smiles, but their smiles and their lives would crumble, though no one knows it yet. My name is Kelly Harrison. I grew up in a rural home with a long history. We had a spacious house and garden in which stood a structure as majestic as a World Heritage Site, with markings spread out as if a UFO had landed. Of course, this was just our mischief. It's a cherished memory created with my father. He succeeded in real estate but had dreamed of being a writer in his youth. However, he would fill the first page of a notebook and then give up the dream, repeating the cycle. These unfinished notebooks were almost all discarded by him. My mother would say, "It's creepy how he always sits in his study alone with his notebook. What's so fun about that?" And my sister openly expressed her disgust. "I hate Dad, he's so dark." Before computers became widespread, he disliked showing his handwritten documents to anyone and used his beloved word processor. This one notebook that I have is the only one that remains. It contains poetry. The first time I saw my father's handwriting, I don't want to comment on the quality of the poetry, but it was clear how much of a romanticist he was. Fascinated by ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena, he would call me out to the garden to set up stones in a Stonehenge-like formation. He created crop circles by cutting the weeds into unusual shapes. I'm probably the only one who knows this side of my father. My mother and sister were only interested in my father as a real estate magnate. He comes home rarely and they consider him as nothing more than a cash cow. When my mother saw the garden art, she criticized it as weird. My sister mocked it as truly foolish. Before I married him, I had no idea he had such silly hobbies. My mother never understood, nor tried to understand my father's hobbies. She was probably only interested in his wealth. Thus she was cold even towards me, who shared his hobbies. Influenced by my mother, my sister was also cold towards my father and me. No wonder he immersed himself in his work. The home environment must have been uncomfortable. To escape this family situation, I moved to New York for university. Seeing this, my sister continually raged about the unfairness. This is despite choosing to remain as the celebrated Miss Harrison in our hometown. I met Matt, a senior in the literature department, and married him at the age of 25. Handsome and considerate was often how he was described, but in reality he was calculative and only impressive outwardly. After we got married, he only saw me as merely an object, and I was continuously exposed to moral and power harassment. He especially belittled my literary circle activities as childish hobbies, and he dismissed my efforts in academics as merely a temporary means for employment. "Anyway, ultimately you are my wife," he would say. In other words, I'm the boss, and you should follow my orders. I couldn't argue with him and always endured. This is the background to the current state of our relationship. He works at a reasonably prestigious company. That should be enough. "What are you unhappy about?" my friends would say. Faced with such comments, I couldn't argue further. I didn't want to worry my father, so I never discussed this situation with him. Also, if my mother and sister knew, it was clear they would mock me for not being able to find a decent man even after going to university. After all, my mother had prioritized finding someone with good judgment and married my father, seeing him merely as an item. My sister, having witnessed my mother's way of life, repeatedly made and broke up with boyfriends. My sister was indeed attractive and popular. However, she seemed to approve of my husband, saying every time she saw me, "Why would someone like you end up with someone like him?" without really knowing his true face. One day, though they rarely contacted me, my mother and sister called me out of the blue, saying, "Bring your husband and come back home quickly." This was because my 65-year-old father had suffered a stroke. Even so, the message, "Come with your husband," was unusual. A nagging sense of unease lingered in my mind. As the house came into view, my husband excitedly said, "Your house is really big." The sparkle in his eye clearly showed his thoughts. "You'll take care of your father," my mother and sister told us, forcing us to live at our family home. Taking care of my father was not a burden, but their intentions were clear. They said they had no time to visit him due to their work, but they actually weren't working. "But we have our own lives," I protested. But my husband easily agreed, saying, "Living here might not be so bad." "Your husband is really kind," the two of them said with satisfied smiles, and my husband couldn't help but laugh, dreaming of a luxurious mansion life. In that space, I couldn't say anything. The next day, I went to visit my father alone. He had regained consciousness but had difficulty speaking. Struggling to speak, he still said, "I'm glad you came," and showed a strained smile. "Actually, I'm going to be living at home with Matt," I told him, and he asked quietly, "Are you getting along well with Matt?" I couldn't answer clearly and just nodded. Even though he wasn't feeling well, my father talked about various things. "I want to create another World Heritage in the garden. When you have a child, let's play together, Kelly, the three of us." "That's right, maybe I'll write a fairy tale for your child," he said, and tired from talking, he slowly closed his eyes. I held my father's hand, and tears naturally flowed from my eyes. He was nearing the end of his life. He wanted to continue feeling the warmth of his family's hands, which should have been important to him. After that, I was the only one who continued to visit my father. Furthermore, I was also tasked with preparing meals for my mother and sister. Of course, I cooked for my husband, and all household chores, including cleaning and laundry, were my responsibility. My mother says that I should fulfill my role as a housewife. My sister was very pleased when my husband visited. When she told me it's not fair about being married to my husband, it was genuinely heartfelt. "Hey, can you carry the bags?" Driving the new car is a bit difficult. My sister frequently invited my husband outside. My husband also seemed to enjoy spending time with my sister, who likes to be noticed. My good-looking husband and my vain, beautiful sister treated each other like accessories to be proud of. They really do make a fitting couple when they are together. Furthermore, they share me as a common emotional outlet. Their hobbies also align. When we return from the hospital, it's apparent that their relationship has deepened. I understood why my mother and sister had insisted on bringing my husband. It was to win him over to their side. Then, they could freely control any inheritance I should receive. Even if the inheritance became entirely mine, my husband would manage it. "Your belongings are my belongings," he believes. Their actions are very blatant, and it's clear they despise me. They seem to think I couldn't possibly oppose them. Whenever I find the time, I secretly enter my father's study and comfort myself with his notebooks and treasures only I know about. This has become my only consolation. These days continued for 2 months. One day, I headed to the hospital with a new paperback book. It was a new release by an author my father loved, and I intended to read it to him by his bedside. However, that day my father passed away. My mother and sister could not hide their excitement. Although they usually did nothing, they were surprisingly quick in preparing for the wake and the funeral. And they quickly moved on to discussing the inheritance. "You aren't thinking of demanding an inheritance, are you?" my mother said, and my sister continued, "You left home for college and marriage, so you shouldn't expect to receive any inheritance." To them, I am labeled as the cold daughter who abandoned her father at 19, and they'd simply tell me, "You should be grateful just to have been there at his end." They say it will somewhat make up for the guilt towards Dad. This was what they meant by letting me take care of him. They ridiculed Dad's hobbies and laughed about it. They never visited him even once. I couldn't say anything in return. I just bit my lip and left the scene. They will likely interpret my silence as consent. Since my father's death was unexpected, my mother and sister are probably trying to convince me while they can. That's why I intuitively felt that I should avoid careless statements. As the funeral preparations progressed, my family seemed unconcerned about me, and their interest in me had almost faded. What I have is a note passed to me in the hospital room by my father, saying, "If anything happens, call this number." I didn't want anyone to overhear, so I locked myself in the study and made the call. No one comes to this study but me. This room holds deep emotions and memories for me alone. I wonder how much I could get if I sold these books on the bookshelf. That's about all my sister and mother have said regarding my father's belongings in the study. So, when I finished the call and opened the door, I faced my husband. "Were you lost in memories?" he interpreted on his own, his expression filled with contempt. Did you talk about the inheritance at the hospital?" That was his remark to his wife who had just lost her father. "It's probably worth $10 million in cash." "And what's your share?" he asked with a mocking laugh. That expression is the true face of him that only I know. He has probably already arranged with my sister about dividing the inheritance. "None," I answered. My husband just said, "Ha," and walked down the hallway. "Divorce me. You know why." The day after the funeral, my husband casually said it. My sister was clinging to him, arms wrapped around his neck. It seemed they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. "What do you mean?" I demanded. I knew the obvious reason but wanted to know more. However, it wasn't he who answered but my sister. She accused me of disrespecting our father and our family home, and my husband sneered, adding, "That's why you can't be trusted." I couldn't believe he could say such things while continuing an affair with my sister, having me as his wife. "We are getting married," my sister proudly declared, now wrapping her arms around his waist. All she ever wanted was a man who would praise her all the time. He was just a tool to praise her, and that was all she needed from him. A satisfied smile appeared on her face. For her, the sense of superiority in stealing him from me seems greater than the marriage itself. Even my mother, who had been watching secretly, happily said, "With this I cut off my ties with you." So from then on, my husband, sister, and mother were strangers to me. I observed the situation objectively, feeling that their actions were despicable and pitiful. And the fact that I was part of the same family as these people also made me feel pitiful about myself. I left the place without saying a word. After they had finished their declarations towards me, it seemed like they had completely lost interest in me. Before leaving the house, I wanted to feel my father's warmth one more time, so I went back to the study and picked up my father's notebook. It contains clumsy poetry, but to me, it is an irreplaceable memory. It is also a part of my father's dreams. When I held the notebook, I had a strange premonition. It felt as though my father was trying to tell me something. Guided by that sensation, I took out a new paperback book from the bag over my shoulder. "Yes, I understand, Dad." I felt as if I could hear my father's voice. This left me without a home. I became alone. Fortunately, a friend let me stay with them for a while. I thought it wouldn't last long. And as expected, I was summoned in less than a month. When I visited my family home after a long time, my mother, sister, and ex-husband, who all had smiles on their faces before, were then gathered with frowns on their foreheads. A lawyer who had contacted me was also present there. Actually, I had been in touch with this lawyer for some time. The note I received from my father contained his contact information, and I already knew the situation, but I pretended it was our first meeting and exchanged greetings. The lawyer didn't touch on that situation and introduced himself again. Then, he began explaining the purpose of why I was summoned. "Let me confirm again. The inheritance from your father, worth $10 million in cash, will be transferred to Kelly." The lawyer explained the details of the inheritance in front of me. My mother and sister should have heard these details from the lawyer the day before. I knew the information too, but I thought it would be unnatural to pretend I didn't know, so I didn't say anything and just listened quietly to the lawyer's talk. "You knew and kept quiet?" my ex-husband confronted me. My mother and sister seemed surprised by his attitude, confused by his drastic change. However, when the lawyer intervened, my sister raised her voice and said, "You said you don't want the inheritance." I had never said such a thing, of course. Of course, this was just an inner monologue, and I made sure not to voice it. As if ignited by my sister's fierce words, my mother also shouted loudly, "I don't remember raising such a daughter." Then, as if the locks on their hearts were released at once, words flew from them nonstop. "I was an exemplary wife and mother. No one loved father as much as we did. In contrast, Kelly abandoned the family. She must have come for the inheritance at the last visit. It's ridiculous that someone like you would monopolize the inheritance. Give it up. That amount is too much for you. We have already made plans using that inheritance." Yes, in the end, it all came down to money. I just quietly observed the situation, which was too mundane to be seen. Thinking that I share the same blood with such people strangely made me feel sad. "Everyone, please calm down," the lawyer called out, finding the right moment. Then, my sister, who had been shouting just moments ago, suddenly tensed up and said, "I have something to discuss. There is a new will that Dad wrote while he was in the hospital. Her expression was clearly more rigid than before. What is she going to say now when she never even showed her face at the hospital? Why didn't you disclose this fact at the beginning? When the lawyer asked my sister, she looked a bit perplexed and answered while looking away. Anyway, you'll understand once you see it. She probably thought I would simply relinquish my rights, but sensing that things might go in an unexpected direction, she made a desperate bet. My sister claimed so, but it was impossible that my father would have written a will under those circumstances. Father wrote in his diary that the inheritance should go to Mother and me, she said. Is that his handwritten notebook? But it should contain nothing but poetry. It's part of the hobbies my mother and sister called creepy, but it's the only proof of my father's handwriting, so she had to rely on it. Then, can we see that diary? The lawyer asked, looking at me. I met the lawyer's eyes and nodded slightly. My sister led everyone to the study with confidence. Then, as she searched the bookshelf, she eventually found the book and handed it to the lawyer. Is this his diary? The lawyer asked while looking at the book he received from my sister. It was clearly a paperback novel. Father was good at avoiding people's eyes, my sister said, and my mother added, yes, he always used that small notebook and didn't want to show it to anyone. Actually, while my father used that paperback-sized notebook, it was mostly composed of blank pages. This paperback was published under the concept of the reader fills in the content, and my father had intended to write his own novels and poetry in it, but eventually he gave up. My mother and sister only know that it was used as a mere notebook by my father. It was his small wish to see his own books on a shelf. Are you sure this is the right book? One asked. There's no mistake. What are you trying to say? My sister answered irritably. Are you sure it's not a mistake with this paperback cover? I pressed further. Stop it. I'm telling you, it's not a mistake, my sister argued back, took the book from the lawyer, and began flipping through the pages. Father's nostalgic handwriting was visible in the corners of the pages. And somewhere on that page might include a will added by my mother. It was a moment I felt my memories were being tarnished. Lawyer, as I mentioned before I spoke up. I opened my mouth before my sister reached the crucial page. The lawyer sighed, looked up from my sister's hands, and quietly stated, unfortunately, that will is a forgery. Why, without checking anything, my sister retorted. I swapped that cover with another book's cover a month ago, I revealed. That day, before leaving the house, I visited my father's study and felt uneasy, so I set up a little trick. Then, I returned the book to a prominent place on the shelf. My sister completely fell for that trap. Why does the cover matter? My sister said defiantly. She didn't stop to think. Why would you do that? It seems her mind doesn't reach that far. What's important is what's written inside, my mother also said. I'll ask you again, are you sure about that cover? I looked into my sister's eyes and asked. The lawyer confirmed, well, she did say there was no mistake. He gestured to me to wrap things up. I took a deep breath. This is the climax. That cover on the notebook was from a book released on the day of Dad's passing, I announced. There was a moment of silence, but it seemed my mother and sister hadn't fully grasped the meaning yet. Their eyes were wavering with anxiety. In short, it was impossible for Dad to have written a will in that book, one said, and my sister and mother's faces gradually turned pale. You forged that will, didn't you? I stated, and it seemed they might understand, but they hadn't thought that far ahead. The forgery of the will should have been easily exposed with proper handwriting analysis, and they were too rushed to realize this fact. It seemed my sister and mother had lost the strength to say anything more. Well, even if the will is fake, my ex-husband broke the silence. Actually, I was shocked that nothing was left to the two of them, he began in a voice trying to elicit sympathy, different from before. He always tries to maintain appearances. You aren't planning to keep everything to yourself, are you? He asked me. Why would he say that? I am no longer his wife or family. However, the lawyer continued. The forgery of a will is a problem. By forging a will, they would lose the right to receive any inheritance, and such an act is considered a legal crime. With that fact in mind, the lawyer hinted at reporting to the police. Then my ex-husband exclaimed, "Oh, that was their doing, I'm unrelated. Hey Kelly, you understand I'm not that kind of person, right?" I was stunned by his statement, speechless. The lawyer gave me a wry smile. How self-centered can he be? What are you saying? My sister, who was in a daze, reacted to my ex-husband's words and shouted. Who would be willing to write it with such a masculine handwriting, she said, and angrily confronted my ex-husband. How can you say it was our doing and not yours? With that, she threw the notebook she was holding at my ex-husband. The notebook flew through the air, hit my ex-husband's shoulder, and fell to the floor. Let me clarify, the lawyer interjected. I was in possession of a notarized document. Even if the content written in the diary was truly from the deceased, the content in the notarized document legally takes precedence, he added. Then, he continued, your actions constitute a criminal act. Realizing this fact, the three of them suddenly began to face reality. I'll explain in more detail. The lawyer was preparing to continue the conversation. There is a concept of statutory inheritance shares in inheritance law. For instance, even if a will specifies that all assets go to a particular person, the actual heirs are guaranteed a certain share of the inheritance. In this case, the wife of the deceased would be entitled to 1/4 and his daughter to 1/8, which sums up to $2.5 million and $1.25 million respectively, though inheritance tax deductions are necessary. When the legal expert conveyed this harsh reality, they slumped down, powerless. The subsequent developments were rather ordinary. Thinking they would receive tens of million dollars, they had borrowed heavily and indulged in spending. I had no interest in their situation when their plans went awry and their debts ballooned. After the lawyer reported them to the police, a police investigation ensued. They escaped criminal charges, but they ended up having to pay fines, and their lives seemed to have become even harder. Since then, I have not been in contact with them. Being bound to such a sister and a violent ex-husband was unpleasant, and I hope they have divorced. My mother looked extremely tired the last time I saw her. I heard that she had been hospitalized, but I did not feel like visiting her. They were the ones who had severed the relationship. My father's notebook, thrown by my sister, had its cover slightly bent, and the pages inside were traced over with lines and badly damaged. This fact saddened me. To my mother, it was nothing more than a creepy object, and to my sister, it was merely a means to deceive others. My ex-husband had seen it only as a tool to generate money, and for them, my father had become a means to produce money. On the other hand, that notebook was a symbol of hope for my father, and for me, it stands as proof of the unfulfilled dreams he left behind. My father was the only truly important family member to me. This makes me question what family really is. Was my father truly happy? Was I a valuable family member to my father? I should have talked more with him. I want to make the garden like a World Heritage Site again. When you have children, let's play together again, Kelly. Maybe I'll write a fairy tale for your child. These were the last words my father spoke on his deathbed, and even now they continue to live on in my heart. Though my father no longer exists physically, the promises we made still breathe within me, and I feel his presence strongly. Therefore, I have firmly decided to carry on the dreams my father left behind and realize them. After paying inheritance taxes, about $4 million remains from the inheritance I received from my father, and I am preparing to continue his legacy with it. My mother and sister moved to start new lives, and the house we had lived in for many years was sold. Currently, I am deepening my studies at university, learning how the various fields of literature, poetry, ancient romances, and even the supernatural are interconnected academically. My life is not luxurious, but my daily studies provide me with a great sense of fulfillment. I am not living alone. I am carrying out the mission of living the lives of two people, bearing my father's legacy. We are united in spirit, moving forward on the path we believe in without being swayed by negative opinions, waves from others. My father was more than just family to me. He was an irreplaceable companion with whom I could share dreams. That's why I am convinced that continuing to pursue the dreams he saw is the most meaningful tribute I can offer him. In this way, though my father is not physically present, I feel that he still lives on with me spiritually. Our shared dreams will continue to shine